In the autumn of 1974, while every other apple grower in Hollis County, Virginia, was backing a truck up to a burn pit, Della Hartwell drove the other way and filled hers with the fruit they were throwing out. It had been a wet spring, the wettest anyone could remember. Rain through April and into May, when the trees were in bloom and the leaves were soft and new. By August, the whole valley knew what that meant. Scab, the brown-black freckling that spreads across an apple's skin in a wet year and turns a clean red dessert apple into something no grocery buyer will touch. Up and down the Blue Ridge foothills, growers walked their rows and found their crop ruined, not in the flesh, which was sound, but on the surface, which was the only part the packing house paid for. So they did what the packing house told them to do. They culled, they dumped, they lit the piles, and let a year of good apples go up as smoke that hung in the hollows for a week. Della stood at the edge of the Sutter place that first morning and watched Dale Sutter pitchfork a wheelbarrow of speckled red delicious onto the fire. The apples hissed and blackened, and the smell of them, sweet and burnt at the same time, carried clear across the road. There were thousands of them, a whole year of pruning and spraying and picking. Sound fruit every one, going to ash because a fungus had freckled their skins. She asked him, quietly, if she could have what he wasn't burning. He looked at her the way you look at a stray that's wandered into the yard. Then he laughed, not unkindly, which was somehow worse, and told her to take all the garbage she wanted. The men with him laughed too, and one of them called after her to mind she didn't poison herself. Word got around by supper. The Hartwell girl was driving the back roads collecting scab apples out of other people's burn piles, the apples not even fit for the cull bin, and loading them into her grandfather's old truck like they were worth something. By the end of that week, they had a name for her at the feed store, the apple beggar. Let me tell you about the apples nobody wanted, because the whole story turns on them. Della was 28 years old that autumn, and she had been alone on the orchard for 9 months, since the morning the previous winter when she had found her grandfather Asa cold in his chair by the cellar door, with a half-finished glass of his own cider gone flat on the table beside him. Her parents had died when she was 6, a car on a wet mountain road, and Asa had raised her among the trees. He was the orchard, as far as she was concerned, and the orchard was him, and when he was gone, the county assumed the place would be sold within the year. It was, everyone agreed, a worthless piece of ground. 40 acres of old, gnarled, half-wild apple trees that Asa Hartwell had stubbornly refused to tear out, planted to varieties nobody had grown for the market in 50 years. You have to understand what apple country had become by 1974. The packing houses wanted one thing, and the buyer for the Blue Ridge Fruit Company, a smooth, heavy man named Roy Vance, said it at every Grange meeting and every orchard he visited. Uniform, red, big. The grocery chains wanted a red delicious that looked like a wax model of an apple, glossy and symmetrical and identically sized, and they did not much care how it tasted, because customers bought with their eyes. So the whole valley had spent 20 years tearing out their old mixed orchards and planting solid blocks of red delicious, spraying them on a calendar, grading them to Vance's standard, and shipping them north by the truckload. Asa Hartwell had refused. While his neighbors grubbed out their old trees and burned the stumps, he kept his. Roxbury russets with skin like brown suede, Harrisons, an old cider apple so forgotten that most people thought it extinct, Hughes crabs no bigger than a walnut, golden russets, black twigs, a row of Albemarle pippins that were knobbed and dull-skinned, and that he swore had more flavor in one bite than an acre of red delicious. They were ugly apples. Several of them were what cidermen called spitters, too sharp or too bitter to eat off the tree, apples that would make you screw up your face and spit. The county thought Asa was a sentimental old fool keeping a museum of fruit nobody could sell. What the county did not understand, and what Della had understood since she was tall enough to reach the press handle, was that those apples were never meant to be eaten. They were meant to be drunk. She could still hear him. They would stand in the high block on an October afternoon, and Asa would pick a Harrison, all rust and yellow and lopsided, and turn it in his hard brown fingers, and say the thing he always said. An apple that's only pretty has got nothing else to say. Then he would hand it to her, and watch her bite it, and laugh when she winced at the bitterness. And he would tell her the other thing, the one she did not fully understand until she was grown. You don't make good cider from one apple, Della. You make it from an argument. The sharp ones and the bitter ones and the sweet ones, all of them fighting, and you stand back and let them work it out. He kept a cloth-bound book in the cellar where he had written down every tree on the place, its variety and its temper, sharp or bitter or sweet or some of each, in a hand that leaned hard to the right. And on a shelf above the press, he kept one stoneware jug, sealed with wax, of the best cider he had ever made, from the frost-touched apples of 1961. He never opened it. He said some things you keep so you remember what you are aiming at. She had her own memory she kept the same way. The spring she was 12, he had set a grafting knife in her hand and shown her how to cut a slip of Harrison and bind it onto a wild rootstock with a strip of cloth and a daub of wax. And he told her that this was how you cheated death. The tree they were grafting from, he said, had been grafted from a tree his own father knew, and that one from a tree from before the First War, and so on, back and back. The same apple passed hand to hand for 200 years, because somebody in every single generation had decided it was worth keeping. When she bit a Harrison now, he told her, she was tasting something older than the county itself. The men burning their crop across the road were tasting nothing at all. They had planted apples bred in a laboratory to ship without bruising, and they had forgotten, or had never known, that a piece of fruit could carry that much time inside it. He left her the orchard, the press, the book, and the jug. He did not leave her any money, because there was none. By that first autumn alone, the trouble was plain, and it was closing in. The land taxes came due in November, and the orchard, graded the way Roy Vance graded it, brought almost nothing. Vance had walked her rows in September, run his thumb over a russet, and pronounced her whole crop cull and cider grade, which in his ledger meant a few cents on the bushel, barely worth the gas to haul it to him. He had offered, in the same breath, to take the land off her hands. The fruit company was looking to plant a new block of dwarf red delicious, he said, and her ridge had good drainage and southern light, and he would give her a fair price, more than the place was worth as it stood. He said it kindly. He said it the way a man says a thing he is certain you will eventually agree to. Della told him the orchard was not for sale. He nodded, the way he nodded at everything, and told her to think on it through the winter, and that the offer would not stand forever. Then the wet spring came, and the scab, and the burning, and Della Hartwell understood that the worst year the valley had ever seen was the only chance she was ever going to get. Here is what the others missed in their panic. Scab is a blemish on the skin. It does nothing to the flesh, nothing to the sugar, nothing to the juice. An apple too ugly to sell in a grocery store is exactly as good for cider as a perfect one, because in the press, it all becomes the same sweet brown liquid, and the skin does not matter at all. The whole county was burning a cider crop and calling it garbage, and her own trees, the russets and the crabs and the bittersweets that already looked half scabbed in a good year, had come through fine, because nobody had been buying them for their looks in the first place. So she gathered. She drove the back roads at first light, before the burn piles were lit, and asked, farm by farm, for the apples they were throwing away, and most of them let her take whatever she could carry, laughing, glad to be rid of it, and gladder still to have a story to tell at the feed store. She filled the truck and unloaded it into the barn, and went back and filled it again. By the end of 2 weeks, She had more apples than the Hartwell place had pressed in a decade, mountains of them, sweet sound fruit cooling in the dim of the barn, and the whole valley thought she had lost her mind, along with her grandfather. She had not lost her mind, but she nearly lost everything else, the week she tried to press. Ace's press was older than she was. A great oak rack and cloth press he had built himself, with a wooden screw as thick as a fence post that came down on the stacked layers of crushed apple and squeezed the juice out into a trough. She had run it with him 100 times. She had never run it alone, and she had never run it hard. And on the third day of pressing, with the barn full of fruit beginning to soften, and a cold front pushing in over the mountains that would turn the whole crop to brown rot if it sat, the old screw split. A long crack ran up the grain, with a sound like a rifle, and the beam sagged, and the press was done. She stood in the cold barn, surrounded by more apples than she could ever save, and a broken press she had no money to replace. And for the first time since the funeral, she let herself cry. The cold front was a day out, maybe less. She could smell it coming, that iron edge to the wind off the mountains, and she knew what it would do. Fruit that had been sound that morning would soften and brown within the week, and the whole foolish mountain of it, everything she had driven those back roads to gather while the county laughed, would rot in the barn and prove every one of them right. There was a man in town who would have sold her a new screw on credit she could not afford. There was Roy Vance, whose offer still stood, who would take the orchard and the trouble both and leave her with money in the bank and nothing to do with her hands, and no more cold mornings, and no more laughter at the feed store. She went up to the house that night and sat at the table where she had found her grandfather. She set his cloth-bound book in front of her, and beside it the sealed jug of 1961 she had never tasted. And she sat there a long while, with her hand flat on the book's worn cover, and she came as close to quitting as she ever would. She did not open the jug. She opened the book. Asa had built that press, and a man who builds a thing writes down how, and there in the back pages, in the hand that leaned hard right, were his drawings, not for the screw, which was beyond saving, but for the press he had used before he built that one, the press his own father had used, a simpler thing, a long lever and a box and a pile of stones for weight. No screw at all. Slower, far slower, but it asked nothing she did not have, because what she had was a barn full of oak beams, a hillside full of stones, and the whole of a long winter with nothing else to do. She built it in 4 days, her hands blistered raw, working by lantern when the light went, and then she pressed, slowly, a layer at a time, the lever creaking down, and the stones stacked on, and the juice running thin and gold into Asa's old trough, and the sweet cidery smell of crushed apple filling the barn, until it was in her hair and her clothes and the back of her throat, the smell of every October she had ever known. She pressed for 3 weeks. She filled every barrel and crock and jug on the place, and when she ran out of vessels, she drove to the next county and bound herself to a debt for more, and she filled those too. Then she carried it all down into the cool dark of the cellar Asa had dug into the hill, and she did the last thing the book told her to do, which was the hardest thing of all. She waited. Cider is not apple juice. Apple juice is what the others made. Thin, sweet stuff, pressed from watery dessert apples, drunk fresh and gone in a week. What Della had pressed was the sharp and the bitter and the sweet all together. Asa's argument, and an argument takes time to settle. Through the winter, the barrels worked. The wild yeast woke and turned the sweetness slowly to something dry and deep, and the cellar filled with a low smell of bread and orchard and stone. And every few weeks she drew the cider off its lees into clean barrels the way the book said, and tasted, and waited again. The Albemarle pippins gave it a brightness like the smell of the orchard in bloom. The Roxbury russets gave it weight, and the Harrisons and the Hughes crabs, the spitters, The apples no one in the county would so much as feed to a hog gave it the thing that the others could never get: a firm tannic backbone, a grip, a length that held on the tongue long after you swallowed. It was, by the time the dogwoods bloomed again, not a country drink. It was something else entirely. Have you ever made a thing alone, through a hard winter, with everyone you know certain you are wasting your life, and then tasted it and known, with no one there to tell you, that it is good? That is the spring Della had. She drew off a glass of the first finished barrel on a warm March evening, sitting on the cellar steps where Asa used to sit, and she tasted it. It was dry and cool, and it opened on her tongue like the orchard in October. Wood smoke and ripe fruit and something darker underneath. And then it held, long after she swallowed, the way he always promised the good ones would, the grip of the bitter apples nobody could stand to eat. She set the glass down on the stone and put her face in her hands, because it was better than anything he had ever made, and he was not there to taste it. But a young woman with a cellar full of cider and a stack of debts cannot stay on the steps. She had to sell it. And that was a problem, because the only thing harder than making real cider in 1974 was convincing anyone to buy it. She started small, because small was all she had. She bottled a few dozen and set up a plank on a sawhorse at the bottom of her lane with a hand-painted sign, "Hard Cider," and for a week, almost nobody stopped, and the ones who did wanted the sweet fizzy stuff they remembered from childhood, and made a face at the dry tannic glass she poured them, and drove off. The valley people did not want it. They had spent their whole lives being told the only good apple was a pretty one, and the idea that the ugly ones made a better drink was an insult to everything they had grubbed and burned to believe. A man could not stand at the feed store and admit the Hartwell girl had been right to keep her museum of spitters, not after he had spent 20 years and a small fortune tearing his own old trees out by the roots. So they told each other it was a fad. They told each other it would not last the season. And Della, with a cellar full of cider and a stack of debts that would not wait for the valley to change its mind, understood she was going to have to find her buyers somewhere else. The man who changed it was not from the valley at all. His name was Gerald Pruitt, and he ran a country inn an hour east, the kind of place where people from Washington and Richmond drove out on weekends to eat trout and pretend they were rich. And he was hunting, that spring, for something to put on his list that the city restaurants did not have. He stopped at the plank on the sawhorse because his wife wanted a basket of the russets Della had set out, and while she chose apples, he took the free taste of cider Della offered, mostly to be polite. She watched his face do the thing the food writer would later describe in a magazine, the thing that had not happened for a single person in Hollis County all spring. He had the glass halfway down when he stopped, and he held it there, and he looked at it, and then he looked at her, and then he took a second, slower taste, the way a man does when he is checking whether he can trust the first one. He asked her what was in it, and she told him, the Harrisons and the Pippins and the russets, the apples everyone else burned, and the dead grandfather and the book, and the broken press, and the lever made of stones. He listened to all of it without saying a word. Then he bought every bottle she had on the plank, 40 of them, and he wrote his telephone number on the back of her sign, and he told her to call him the moment she had more, and that he meant it, that she was not to sell another bottle to a living soul until she had called him first. That was the first weekend of May. By the first weekend of June, the inn could not keep it on the table. People drove out from the city, ordered the trout, and asked for a second bottle of the cider to take home. And Pruitt called Della and doubled his order, and then doubled it again. And a wine writer who had eaten at the inn drove the hour west to find the orchard the cider came from, and stood in Della's barn asking questions and taking photographs of the lever press made of stones. The piece ran that autumn in a magazine that the people of Hollis County did not read, with a photograph of Della in the high block holding a knobbed, rust-skinned Albemarle pippin under a headline about the finest farmhouse cider in America being pressed from the apples a whole valley had thrown on the fire. And then the second autumn came, the autumn of 1975, and Della Hartwell did the thing that put her name in the mouth of every grower who had ever laughed at her. She had only so much cider, because she had only so many of the old trees, and the demand by then was far past what she could fill. So she did not try to fill it. She bottled what she had, all of it, the whole year's pressing, and she announced that she would sell it over a single weekend in October, at the orchard, first come, first served, and not a bottle before or after. She did it partly because she had no other way to handle the crowd, and partly because Asa had taught her that a thing people have to wait for is a thing they decide they cannot live without. They came up the ridge that Saturday, before the sun was fully over the mountains. By 8, there were cars parked a half-mile down the county road, city cars and farm trucks both, and a line in the cold along the orchard fence. And Della and 2 girls she had hired stood at a plank table under the Albemarle pippins and sold cider as fast as they could carry it up from the cellar. People who had never spoken to her, people who had called her the apple beggar a year before, stood patient in the cold with their cash folded in their hands and waited their turn, and a few of them, when they reached the table, did not quite manage to meet her eye. They sold out by 2 o'clock on Saturday. A year's work, gone in 6 hours, to people who had driven 4 hours for a single bottle of something pressed from Scab apples. There were cars still coming up the ridge at 3, and she had to walk the line and tell them, gently, that there was nothing left, that they would have to come back next October. Not one of them was angry. They only asked her when. They wrote it down. The growers who had come up out of curiosity, the ones who had pitchforked their own crop onto the fire the year before, stood at the fence and watched the line and did the arithmetic. And the arithmetic was brutal. Della Hartwell was getting more for a single bottle of cider than they got for a bushel of perfect red delicious, and she was making it from the apples they could not give away. Roy Vance came up the ridge the following spring. He came alone, in his own car, and not the fruit company truck, and he parked at the bottom of the lane and walked up, which a man like Vance did not do, and he found Della in the cellar, racking cider off the lees. He stood in the doorway a while and watched her work, and looked at the rows of barrels, and at the cloth-bound book open on the bench, and at the sealed jug of 1961, still up on its shelf where she had left it. And when he spoke, his voice did not have the certainty she had heard in it for 9 years. "We had a man drive down from a hotel in New York," he said, "asking for your cider by name, asking me, like I'd know." He took off his hat, which she had never once seen him do. "I have been buying and selling apples in this county for 30 years, Della. I graded your whole crop cull and told you to sell. I sat in your grandfather's kitchen and told him to tear out those trees. Every grower I advised, I told the same thing, pretty and red and uniform." He looked at the barrels again. How did you make this out of what we threw away?" Della set down her tube and wiped her hands on her apron and looked at him for a moment. This man who had set the price of her whole life and priced it at nothing. "You wanted apples that all looked the same," she said. "My grandfather kept the ones that didn't, the sharp ones and the bitter ones and the ugly ones, the ones with something to say." She nodded at the barrels. "You can't make this from one kind of apple, Mr. Vance. You make it from the argument. You spent 20 years telling this whole valley to get rid of the argument. I just kept mine." He stood with that a long moment. Then he put his hat back on, and he did a thing that cost him more than the words had. He asked if he might buy a bottle. She sold him one, at the same price as everyone else, and he carried it down the ridge to his car, and Della went back to her barrels. Let me tell you what that valley looks like now. The years after were the good kind, the slow kind. Della never planted a single block of one apple, never chased the volume she could have chased. When growers in the county finally understood that the old, ugly varieties were worth more in a bottle than the pretty ones were on a shelf. They came to her, hat in hand the way Vance had, and she did not gloat, and she did not hoard. She gave them grafts, cuttings off Ace's Harrisons and Roxbury Russets, and the row of Albemarle Pippins, the trees the whole county had spent a generation tearing out. She handed back to them by the bundle, with a page copied from the cloth-bound book, telling them the temper of each one, sharp or bitter or sweet. Within 10 years the burn pits were gone, and the hollows smelled of pressing again every October, and the magazines called it a revival, as if the thing had come from nowhere, as if it had not come down a gravel road in a dead man's truck. She bought back land. When the growers who had bet everything on Red Delicious finally could not make the payments, because the grocery chains had moved on to a newer, redder, more uniform apple, and left them with blocks of trees nobody wanted. She bought the old Sutter place, the one with the burn pit, and she turned the cows of the next valley out of her mind and planted it, slowly, over years, to the old varieties, grafting and waiting, until the worst orchard ground in the county was the most sought-after harvest in the state, and the premium cider makers as far away as the city drove out every autumn to buy the apples that a whole generation had been certain were garbage. Roy Vance's company folded inside a decade. The grocery apple ate itself, the way Asa always said it would, chasing looks until there was no flavor left to chase. The inn still stands. The wine writer who found her barn went on to write a book, and there is a chapter in it about a lever press built of oak and stones, and a young woman who waited out a winter while a county laughed. Della Hartwell is an old woman now, with her grandfather's hard brown hands. She still presses every autumn, though slower, and she still sells over a single weekend in October, and the line still runs down the ridge before the sun is over the mountains. On a fine afternoon you might find her in the high block with a girl of 9 or 10 beside her, a grandniece who has her grandmother's way of going quiet among the trees. She will pick a Harrison, all rust and yellow and lopsided, and turn it in her fingers, and say the thing Asa always said, that an apple that's only pretty has got nothing else to say. Then she will hand it to the girl, and watch her bite it, and laugh when she winces. The cloth-bound book is the girl's now, the hand that leans hard right, the temper of every tree. And up on its shelf in the cellar, the stoneware jug of 1961 still sits, sealed in wax, unopened, the thing you keep so you remember what you are aiming at. They laughed at the apples she pulled out of the fire. They called them scab and cull and garbage, and they told her she was a fool to keep the ugly trees, and a bigger fool to want the ugly fruit. She kept them anyway. She pressed them slow, through one long winter, while the whole valley waited for her to fail. And the old trees, the gnarled and the bitter and the scarred, the ones that had been told their whole lives they were worth nothing, remembered every season of it, and gave it all back in the glass.